So we have completed another Soulsborne marathon. This time we beat every single game at level 1. Now I was actually planning to make a video going over which one is the hardest or which one is the easiest, but that video would just be very subjective and just based on my own personal experiences, and being that there are some games that I'm just a lot better at than others, it probably wouldn't really make for the best video. So instead what we're going to do is go over the best weapon or best collection of weapons for every single game if you were to beat it at level 1. So if you're a person that's planning to do a level 1 run with any of these games, hopefully this video helps you out. The Demon Souls level 1 starting class is the Royalty. This is actually going to be a magic and dexterity based class. Also does start off with the Soul Arrow magic spell, which magic in this game is just incredible. It just melts everything. Now it's level 1. It's not going to be the most optimal way to go about it. It still is going to be pretty viable, especially if you end up using the magic boosting rings and the clever rat ring alongside the Morion blade. You can still do respectable damage and it can actually beat the game. And being that they don't consume stamina and you can use it at a safe distance, it can actually be a very beginner friendly way of doing it. Although if you do want to optimize damage and just melt bosses as quickly as possible, the weapons are just going to be doing it better. Which typically in level 1 runs in the Souls games, using quicker and smaller weapons are just going to be best because 1, they don't weigh as much, meaning that you don't really need much equipment load, and 2, they're going to be consuming less stamina as well. Which curved swords, straight swords, and daggers are just going to be the best ones at doing this. The daggers will be getting the highest amount of DPS, and they obviously consume the least amount of stamina. Me personally, I like curved swords better because they're almost just as fast, but they just lunge really far and they're just so much easier to use. You hardly ever really miss with a curved sword, but there's plenty of times in which you just like miss your target with a dagger. So in terms of easy use, I like curved swords better. And conveniently, the Crescent Falchion is going to be one of the best options to have for almost any single type of run. Now you do get this at area 4-1, of which going through this section is incredibly annoying with those skeletons. So before going into this section, I recommend just picking up the club in area 1-1 or the blessed mace in 5-1 because they're very weak to striking damage and these things can just trivialize them. Now the blessed mace can actually be a very decent alternative for the entire playthrough, but unfortunately grabbing faint stones is not going to be as easy. But the reason why the Crescent Falchion is so good in particular is because it already comes crescent infused at +1, and Moonshade stones are so easy to acquire. You get plenty of them in this location, and you can buy an infinite amount directly after you kill the Adjudicator, which is obviously not that challenging of a boss. You can pretty much just spam a bunch of soul arrows if you wanted to. And directly after this boss, there's lots of Moonshade Stone chunks as well. And you can easily get a +4 weapon, which is almost maxed out, and you only had to kill one boss. And if you go ahead and do a little bit of farming, or even just kill the next boss to respawn the Crystal Lizards, you can get a maxed out Crescent Falchion, which not only is that going to just decimate all of the first area bosses in the Arkstones, but basically just destroy everything in the entirety of area 2 because a lot of those enemies are just weaker to magic damage. Now, unfortunately, once you get later into the game, a lot of enemies are going to be magic resist, especially the final boss in Alant, which this boss is quite literally the hardest base game boss to do at level 1 in the entire series. There was no other boss that I struggled with more than this one. His attacks are just way too fast. So being that this is the biggest challenge, you definitely want to play around it. So there are going to be 2 other weapons of which we are going to acquire. 1 is going to be a longsword, and 2, either the secret dagger or a scimitar. The longsword is because we're going to actually eventually turn this into the Morion blade, because this paired alongside the clever rat ring could just boost our damage by like over 150% when at lower health, and this could just destroy everything in the entire game. And you also do want to go get a secret dagger or a scimitar, probably even a falchion. That's going to be a better option. You can actually buy that off Grave Robber Blige as well. And this is actually going to be our main damaging option. When you're going through area 2, all the hard stones you get go towards the longsword, and all the sharp stones you get will go towards one of these 2 weapons. Now, as I mentioned earlier, whatever one they're actually more comfortable with is going to be which one you end up choosing. If you're perfectly fine with the pull range that a dagger gets, then secret dagger is going to be best. If you're struggling with the dagger range, then just go with a falchion. But once you actually have this upgraded to like +9 at least, then stacking up on a bunch of pine resin and black pine resin is going to make it output a decent amount of damage, and then putting yourself as lower health with a Morion blade and clever rat ring, it's just not even close. Everything is just going to be deleted. The Dark Souls 1 level 1 starting class is the Pyromancer, and funnily enough, Pyromancy Flame is probably going to be the best thing to use in a level 1 run, because pyromancies are just broken. They don't have any scalings, and as long as you just constantly level up your pyromancy flame, which just requires souls, you can just do amazing damage without any types of stat investment. Now the downside is that it does require a lot of souls, but you're doing a level 1 run. What else are you going to spend your souls on anyway? So might as well just dump it all into the pyromancy flame. And for some other reasons why pyromancies are really good at level 1 is that you do start off with 2 spell slots, and pyromancies don't have any requirements. So you can go ahead and throw in things like Great Combustion alongside Power Within, or you can just throw in something like Great Chaos Fireball or Chaos Storm and just destroy bosses that way. But if you were to talk about weapons themselves, there aren't going to be many amazing options because the Pyromancer starting class gets 9 dexterity, which you can't really use a lot of the good weapons in the game. Basically like no great swords, halberds, straight swords, or even katanas, you can't really use any of those. So you're kind of limited to just like a bunch of hammers really, which thankfully there is actually a really good hammer in the blacksmith giant hammer. Reason why this one is so good is because it does get the most range in class and it just gets immensely high base damage. It does only require Twinkling Titanites, which is very easy to grab, doesn't require any embers, and at +5, it gets you 180 base physical damage and 300 lightning damage, which this is a perfect amount to carry throughout the entire game, and you can do decent damage from start to finish. Now obviously you can't buff this weapon, but just throwing on something like Red Tearstone Ring with power within, and then everything is just going to be decimated. Now the downside to this weapon is that it is going to be acquired in Analondo off the blacksmith, so you are going to need something to use up until that point, of which our only options, as I mentioned, is just going to be hammers. I went with a reinforced club. You do get it very early on, does do some nice damage and some nice poise damage. I recommend stacking up on a bunch of gold pine resin, because using this can just destroy the early game bosses. And when it comes to the iron golem, you can just use poise damage to just knock him off the ledge. And at that point, you can just go pick yourself up the blacksmith giant hammer. The Deprived is the level 1 starting class in Dark Souls 2, and this game is kind of where it did take off in terms of build creation that you can have at level 1 because it did introduce some stat boosting things via rings, armor sets, and even weapons. So there are plenty of different ways you can build around a level 1 character. Now just like in Dark Souls 1, you can use pyromancers because these spells don't have any requirements, and you can do some very nice damage without even any stat investment. Now your weapons are still going to be doing more damage, because in this game you get more damage out of rings than you actually do by putting points into stats. But that's not to say that pyromancers are useless, because you get access to things like Poison Mist and Toxic Mist, which poison and toxic in this game are just completely broken. They do insane damage over time, and a lot of enemies in this game are just very weak to it as well. Now the downside for this is that the Deprived actually does start out with 6 in every single stat, and you need at least 10 attunement to actually get an equipment slot. So you won't really be able to use any types of spells until you pick up the Southern Ritual Band. But in terms of the weapons themselves, as I mentioned, there are plenty of different ways that you can go. I think the mace is going to be the best one, specifically a raw infused mace. Now, hammers in this game are probably some of the best, if not the best weapon class in the entire game. Almost everything is just wicked to striking damage, and these things can output some very nice DPS, very solid movesets, don't consume much stamina, really high poise damage, and you even get some pretty decent counter damage as well. Now the mace is especially good for level 1 because it does get some very nice base damage, and you can use it without any different types of stat boosting items. All you need to do is two-hand the weapon and you're basically perfectly fine. It can carry you from start to finish with great ease. Just pick yourself up a bunch of gold pine resin. Now there are a couple of different things that you can do as well. If you are going to the DLC, I probably recommend going with the Craftsman's Hammer instead, because this one is going to be the direct upgrade. It gets way more base damage, and it also does get the highest counter damage in class as well. Now the downside is that it does have higher requirements at 20 strength and 10 dexterity, which is going to require you to either get the strength and dexterity ring, or better yet, just picking up the vessel shield, which this actually is unfortunately going to be accessed in the 3rd DLC after the first boss, which is basically why I recommended this one to be for the DLC specifically. Because just having the vessel shield equipped is just going to help you meet the requirements, and you can just get a better version of a mace to clear out the DLC. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that when you do have the vessel shield in your offhand, that means you're not going to be able to equip the ladle, which having the ladle in the offhand is really nice because it does actually give you some more adaptability, which having the ladle and the entire peasant set equipped does put you at exactly 92 agility, which that is basically the threshold for 10 iframes. So getting rid of 1 point from adaptability means that you don't get those 10 iframes. Otherwise, you're going to have to use some more ring slots like the Simpleton's Ring to get some more iframes, when you could be spending those ring slots on the Ring of Blades, the Flynn's Ring, potentially even the Southern Ritual Band, and the Chloranthy Ring. There's plenty of amazing options that you can do, so you don't really want to limit yourself. But obviously another weapon that's going to be really good is going to be the Rapier. This one might be the easiest one to use in terms of fighting bosses. It's just so quick. You get really quick recovery frames. It does not consume much stamina at all, and it probably just gets the highest DPS in the entire game. Now the downside is that it does require 12 dexterity, which you can only really get to that point when having the dexterity ring with the Kale Helm, or having the Kale Helm with the Work Hook. But I don't really recommend going with the Work Hook because that does decrease your adaptability, and that is not really good to have in a level 1 run. Dark Souls 3 at level 1 is going to be another game of which you do have lots of different types of options due to it having some stat boosting rings. There are plenty of weapons that you actually can use at level 1. Now I know some popular options will be things like the Bandit's Knife and the Dragon Slayer's Axe, but the straight swords are just way too good to pass up. Just stick with the broadsword every single time. Straight swords are just the best weapon class in Dark Souls 3, and it kind of isn't even close. These things have such incredible speeds. With their one-handed light attack, it lunges really far. You get a very nice horizontal spread, which is great in a game where you get a bunch of enemies that just gank you. And in a game where like enemies have zero poise, straight swords are just more than enough. These things consume basically like next to no stamina. You can just constantly spam R1. And the broadsword is just probably going to do it best because it does get the highest amount of base damage when raw infused. You get it literally right at the beginning of the game, requires 10 strength and dexterity, which is the base stats of what you get with the deprived. Doesn't weigh that much, stands as a very versatile weapon art. Now the only downsides to the broadsword in particular is that it does get some of the worst range in class, and its heavy attack is not going to be a poke. It is actually going to be a very nice lunge, which I probably do prefer in certain situations, but in a lot of cases it's probably just nicer to have a poking attack instead, of which going with a longsword is going to be a nice alternative. But yeah, just have this bad boy raw infused, pick yourself up a bunch of different types of pine resin, and depending on which boss that you actually go up against, use that particular pine resin of which they're weak to, and you'll have yourself an absolute field day with every single boss. Now, something like the Dragon Slayer's Axe can be very nice because it also does get really high amounts of base damage with its split lightning and its ability to be infused. So having that raw infused can be very good, and it can do more damage per hit. So if you are in a situation of which you're fighting enemies that don't give you very long openings, and you can only really hit one time throughout that opening, the Dragon Slayer's Axe might be better, but it does require certain types of rings to meet the requirements, and it also just does way more as well. And there's plenty of rings in this game that you'd really benefit off to boost your neutral game, or even to give you more spell slots so you can use something like Tears of Denial. But the only other weapon that I probably would recommend getting would be the Storyteller Staff. Reason being is because this thing can just cheese Half-Light, and Half-Light is probably the hardest boss in the entire game. I'm not even lying. When I did my level 1 run, I did a lot of bosses first try. Half-Light took me like 30 minutes. I hate this boss. Please, if you're gonna do it and gonna fight Half-Light, just pick up the Storyteller Staff. It'll be so much better. Bloodborne is the only of the Souls games that actually doesn't get a level 1 starting class. The lowest actually being the Waste of Skin, which starts off at level 4. And level 1 playthroughs in this game is probably going to be the least interesting compared to all the other games. It basically is like the exact same thing as a regular playthrough, but you're just doing less damage and you just have a lot less health. In the other games, you had like particular types of weapons that were good at level 1. There were certain types of like ring combos, maybe certain types of spells you could use, infusions that were really good at level 1. But in this game, there's nothing really like that. You're basically using the exact same weapons. Your blood gems you use are basically the exact same, and even your runes to an extent. And in terms of the gameplay, it doesn't really change up much. Only difference being is that after you get like a backstab or a parry, I wouldn't go with a visceral attack. I would just go with like a charged heavy attack instead, because for whatever reason, they decided to make visceral attacks scale off a stat in skill instead of weapon level and weapon damage. Don't really know why they did that. Still hate it to this day. But with that being said, it's either going to be the Saw Cleaver or the Saw Spear. I recommend the Saw Spear. I like that one better. Even though it does get less base damage, does get a little bit more range. It does stay serrated, both transformed and untransformed, which means you're just going to be doing more damage against beasts with those transformed attacks, which these transformed attacks are just absolutely incredible. They just do so much damage, they're very quick, and don't really consume much stamina. And also the Saw Cleaver transform state does get thrusting attacks, which thrusting damage is going to be really nice against certain types of bosses. But the main reason why both of these weapons are just really good to have, just in general and not just at level 1, is because they just output amazing DPS, they're really quick, don't consume much stamina, and probably the most important reason, like the most important reason why these weapons are just amazing, and especially at level 1, and it's because it builds up Beasthood so fast. It literally takes like 3 or 4 transformed attacks to like fully max out a Beasthood meter. And Beasthood is probably the most important thing in a level 1 run. Just getting Beast Blood pellets and stacking up that damage is literally the difference between having like a 5-minute boss fight and like a 2-minute boss fight. These things can help you boost that much more damage. And the best thing about these weapons is that you get them literally right at the beginning of the game. You just pick them up and they can carry you from start to finish, and you'll have next to no problems, although you're doing it at level 1, so you're probably going to run into some problems, because Bloodborne is definitely really not built for level 1. These bosses can be pretty challenging. The Elden Ring starting class at level 1 is going to be the Wretch, gives you 10 in every single stat, and this game by far has the most amount of freedoms at level 1 in terms of build creation. There are so many different talismans, great runes, even weapons that can actually stat boost, and obviously you get your Wondrous Flask with a bunch of crystal tears that can give you literally plus 10 to almost every single stat. And with all of these things, you can basically wield hundreds of different types of weapons, use dozens of different spells, and honestly do some very nice damage as well. Now, with that being said, the best weapon to use at level 1 is going to be the Iron Balls or the Starfist. Not only is it incredibly dominant, but it is so easy to build around as well. Doesn't require have to stack 1,000 different types of buffs just to benefit off it. You can just throw these bad boys on, just spam charged heavy attacks, because everything that you need to go with a charged heavy attack build is literally right at the beginning. Axe Talisman, Spiked Tier, Strength Tier, even Cragblade. You just pick up these few things, and the entire playthrough is just a GG. These heavy attacks come out so incredibly fast, do amazing damage, do over 33 stance damage, meaning that you can poise break with this weapon faster than almost any other weapon in the entire game, and do amazing damage while you're doing it. Now, yes, another popular option will be the Serpent Hunter, of which that one might be better earlier on in the game if you do have a decent strategy to kill the Godskin Noble, because it is going to be a Sombra-based weapon, of which Sombra weapons are very easy to build around right at the beginning of the game. You could easily get it to +9, of which when you have a +9 Sombra weapon, it is going to just outclass almost any other smithing weapon at earlier on in the playthrough. But once you do get a little bit in, the Iron Balls and the Starfist are just going to be the much better option. Obviously, the Starfist being better than the Iron Balls, you do get it a bit later, but it does just do more damage and have bleed for basically the exact same requirements and weight. So yeah, there are plenty of different weapons that you can use with an Elden Ring level 1 playthrough. And if you do want to see a video, I can make a top 10 because there are lots of really good options that I did want to talk about. So if you do want to see that video, please do like and subscribe for that. But yeah, that's basically the entire video done. In terms of the next Soulsborne video, I'm probably going to be ranking the Twin Blades. Obviously, there's not many games that have Twin Blades. I probably end up doing a marathon for that anyway. So definitely do give me a follow on Twitch. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.